Hello and welcome to Plus Size Kiting and my 2024 wrap-up of what I consider the best big air and general big air progression kites of the last year or so. This list is of course based on my and my friends' personal experiences on the gear, along with some additional thoughts based on how the kites have performed at the pro level, and some additional input from the many riders I have had the fortune of chatting to over the year, either through my comment sections, personal messages, or just meeting you in person. If you are stumbling upon this video and have not seen any of my reviews in the past, a quick reminder: I do not work in the industry, nor do I receive any money for these reviews, although I do have a community tips page that I set up to get some help with the making of them, mainly for the cost of flights to chase the wind around New Zealand. So you can check that out if you go through the link in the description if you like the content. First and foremost though, a massive thank you to Mac Kiteboarding, who have helped me get a lot of the demo gear I needed for so many of the reviews over the years. And you can find almost all of the gear I discuss in this video on their website, so I have added a link to them in the description as well, of course. In regards to the rankings and selected kites in each category, first off I need to take into consideration that I'm over 100 kgs and I'm mainly testing 9-meter size kites in 25 to 35 knots or more. So in a lot of cases, smaller riders would probably be getting a similar experience to me, with each kite a size down likely, at least a lot of the time. Brands may perform also slightly different in comparison to others when looking at size for size, so that is something you may need to consider as well. I will be trying to briefly explain my thought process for each category, what I'm looking for in the kite for me to enjoy it, and what type of rider or riding style I think will benefit the most from each kite mentioned. Naturally, I won't be going into as much detail on each kite as I did in the reviews themselves, so if you want to know more on each kite, you'll just have to watch those specific reviews. I should also mention that in Auckland, we have had a particularly poor windy season this last year, so I think I might have found that this year I put a little bit more weight versus last year on the kites that had more power, and in some cases a little bit better low end, because I was trying a lot of the 9-meter kites in some of the testing sessions from as little as 22 to 25 knots, and not always testing them only in 30 plus knot sessions, although I did test all of these kites multiple times. It is also why I had to fly down to Wellington so many times to get reviews completed, because frankly they get a lot more wind than we do, even if it's not often the cleanest or easiest wind to ride in. As always, I would also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. For example, I'd love to see each person's top kite or top 3 kites of the year, and what kites they are most excited in seeing a review of in 2025. My ability to get hold of kites to test and review is based mostly on the popularity and comments on these videos, of course. Now, with all that out of the way, let's get on to the picks for each category, and for each of them I will mention what I think of, both for standard Dacron I should say, and Alula, because of the huge range in pricing for each. I know Brainchild in particular products tend to land somewhere in the middle of that price range, but so do some of the more costly brand Dacron kites like high-end duotone models, so I'll try to fit them into the mix as well in the respective areas. So first off, let's get started with boosting. So when it comes to boosting, for me it's not just about the pure power and the potential boost you can get from a kite, as we've found that the style of the kite certainly has a big impact as well for most riders to be able to get the most out of that power. So when thinking about this category, we have to decide, do you pick the kites with the potential that you may be able to achieve, with the ones that have an overall ease of boosting when you first jump on them? Is it the kite that is just liftier and catches every gust by default? Or of course some combination of everything? Kites like the Cabrina Moto X Designworks or the Slingshot NXT, for example, were certainly kites that seemed to have a lot of lift and boosting potential, but we didn't always find we could access it consistently, particularly in the more challenging gusty conditions. Other kites, like the Ozone Vortex or Harlem Thrive, were a lot easy for us to use, to both control in general and to find the power in them, but they didn't seem to quite have the same top end or lift as our eventual winner as the wind got really serious. I know from my old XRs that those power monsters, like in that range, may possess the most boosting potential ability on the market, but sadly, due to lack of access, I still have yet to try an XR8 or the XR Pro, so I can't consider them in this assessment. Then, of course, there's kites like the Fly Surfer Era that certainly deserves a mention here, not only because I personally witnessed Hugo's Woo World Record boost on his, but I have also seen a couple other local friends this year set new PBs on them with their first few sessions. Although the kite sure is powerful, I don't think it is one of the top few in all wind ranges, as I would put it a little bit more of its magic in a good rider's ability to hold down a ton of power with it in nuking winds, due to a bit to its design and the small touches like pulleys in the bridle, but I don't think it's a guaranteed boost machine in all conditions for everyone. Now, with all of that said, what kind of kite did we all just find had consistent power in all big air conditions? That was pretty much the easiest to make the most of as well for everybody who tied it. Well, that's no surprise probably, it's the Duotone Rebel. In both the SLS and the DL versions, topping both the Alula and non-Alula categories, with the D-Lab version coming out a little bit higher than the SLS overall. There's no denying it's one of the easiest sheet-and-go boosters on the market, with great stability and the ability to hold down an outrageous amount of power as the wind gets nuclear. Sure, it might be just a bit more intimidating as the wind gets strong due to heavier bar pressure, but all in all, this is definitely the best booster for us of 2024. Next up, let's look at looping, which proved to be an even more challenging category to assess, really, because things get a little bit more personal yet again. Are you looking for purely the fastest kite, the smoothest that moves through the loop, something that is lighter on the bar, a kite that stays nice and high in the window for the softest, more forgiving loop that's easier for doing your first loops or progressing with? Or do you lean into kites that get around well enough but also provide a liftier, friendly heli loop as you descend? For me, the answer has to be a little bit of everything, of course, but basically every big air kite on the market these days loops so well. It's quite hard to go wrong there picking a modern loop-friendly kite. And in reality, if you were looking at sizes under 9 meter in particular, everything is going to be good enough at looping to progress with into your first loops. With that in consideration, however, let's look at a few of the top choices. As you may have heard from my many previous videos, for the last few years I've personally found the standard orbit one of, if not the easiest kite to get into your first loops and even continue on to loop progression, particularly in the 9 meter size. But there is no denying that the Orbit Pro does loop faster and in a very similar way, as does the amazing Cabrina Nitro V2. Then there's also the Fly Surfer Era that loops with a very similar space and style, but a little more grunt and yank to its loops, so perhaps a bit more intimidating to use. But with all that said, with Dacron kites, it's still very hard to look past these kites for those looking to get into your first loops and progress with basic loop tricks. In the Alula realm, there is no doubt the Core Pace is one of the fastest loopers you can find, but if you've seen that review, it comes, for me at least, in a overall harder to handle package, more designed for a higher level of rider in my opinion, and I found as well the heli loops a bit trickier to master. I personally found the Slingshot NXT a dream to do loop tricks with, as it was quick enough, but added a lot of lift after the loop as well. But between my group of friends, they all tended to agree in the Alula area the Ozone Vortex was overall easier to loop and to focus more on loop progression with, at least in the mid-range wind under 30 to 35 knots. Now, with all of that said, one kite that everyone agreed was not only lightning fast, but still surprisingly easy to adapt to because of its lighter bar pressure and effortless flight characteristics, and that would be the Harlem Thrive. So in all sizes really, it comes out on top and is my pick for the best looping kite of 2024. And for our final category before we get into the overall list, next up would be confidence building, where once again, in general, most of the current kites, when compared to anything from as little as 2 to 3 or even 4 years ago, are a huge step up in their general ease of use. And although many are a lot faster and more powerful, they still tend to be easier to adapt to and progress with, I find. Some of the kites I've mentioned give you more confidence to do loops, others to try new board off tricks, add rotations, or some just give you more confidence to ride them in more challenging and extreme conditions like higher winds. It's a bit hard to narrow it down to just one kite in this category, but starting at a more beginner to intermediate level for moving into big air, for Dacron kites, it is hard to, as always, look past the standard orbit, and for Alula, I'd have to narrow it down to the ozone vortex, at least in the 8 or 9 meter sizes. If you are looking at 9 meters and up, the Harlem Thrive is probably my go-to, at least from 10 meters and up, because although it is fast, it is a very easy to handle and adapt to style of ride. If you are already a little bit more experienced and want to ride in higher winds, perhaps consider the Fly Surfer Era, the Orbit Pro or the Nitro 2 in the Dacron area, and it's worth considering the Slingshot NXT if you want to splash out on Alula. All of these kites are great options, so it is really hard for me to just pick one as the best overall confidence booster, but if I had to narrow it down, I would probably go for the Ozone Vortex for all level of riders, looking to cover the most areas to progress in. If you follow my Instagram, you would have seen all the recent story content of my wife and I on holiday in Western Australia, and the 9 meter I chose to take with us was the Vortex, as it was the one kite I was very sure I could ride powered to do loops and tricks on that was still easy enough for my wife to progress into her very first jumps, as she is a beginner, and now it's actually become her favorite kite. So those are my various thoughts on each category, but what do I think are the actual best kites when you bring it all together? So here we go, my top big air kites of 2024. At number 6 equal, the North Orbit Pro and the Cabrina Nitro Apex, or the version 2 of the Nitro. It's too hard to pick between them when comparing them to the rest of the market. They are both amazing looping kites that can be ridden easily by most riders in conditions towards the end of their limits. They are a bit more challenging to use than a standard orbit, but certainly not impossible to get the hang of for most riders with a little practice. Certainly at least in sizes 9 or 10 and up. They can't go any higher on this list, however, because they lack the natural power of the kites I've chosen above them. However, in both cases, there is a higher spec Alula model, which I personally do also really enjoy, but I don't find those models as easy to use, and I think they would likely hinder progression for most riders. So that is why I would pick these two models over them in this position. At number 5, the Fly Surfer Era. Just squeaking in, as I did review this kite in January 2024, and although I had the order of these kites a little differently in last year's top 5, with more time on both the Era, the Rebel, and these other kites, I found they were a little bit easier to use with more experience, and especially as I mentioned this year, I was really drawn more to kites that had more power in them and more boosting potential. And with the rest of its performance being so close to the last two, and added power, I give this kite the slight edge into the top 5. At number 4, equal, the Duotone Rebel SLS and D-Lab. Surely the best overall booster of the year deserves to be in the top 5. If you watch my reviews on these kites, you will learn what I find to be the differences between them. and how much I love to ride each of them. They would also likely be my favorite kites of the year in smaller sizes, like a 7 or 8 meter, to be riding when absolutely lit, when my only goals are to jump big and do big single loops with no technical elements. Sadly, they are not quite as versatile or as good for general progression as the kites I would put above them, but they are some of the most fun kites you can have. Now, onto my top 3. You could really move this order around a lot depending on your style of riding, what the conditions are, and what you're looking to do in a session. And particularly for me, what mood I'm in. I certainly recall that with my first session on each of the next 3 kites, when after I rode each of them, I thought to myself, that could very well be the kite of the year right there. But gun to my head, if I had to pick my order that's not just for me, but for I think most people, I'd narrow it down to, at number 3, the Slingshot NXT, an amazing all-around big air focused kite with probably the highest boosting potential and hang time of the top 3, but does lose a little ground on the next 2 for being slightly harder to use, we found for our group. That said, it was just for me personally what I would probably give the Slight Edge as my personal favorite for the top spot. But I think the more user-friendly nature of the next 2 should give them the edge for a larger spectrum of riders likely to be watching this. At number 2, the Harlem Thrive, the fastest kite I tested, the current double loop king. It is super versatile for other disciplines and very easy to use. Its one knock is that as a 3-strut kite, it can lose its shape a bit in strong conditions and doesn't quite have the same lift or boosting potential I feel as the other top 4 kites. With that all said, here it is, my overall kite of the year at number 1, the Ozone Vortex. Although it really isn't the best in any category, it's pretty damn great for all of them because it's so easy to use from near beginner level right through to pro. It's great for loops and progression while also having a lot of power and hang time. The major knock against it versus the other top few is that it isn't quite as user friendly in the top end conditions, talking 30 to 35 knots plus, but I still found it to do the job, recently having had a nice 35 knot session on the 9, throwing mega loops with ease and sending numerous woosts into the 20s while I was on my holiday. Also very confident in its versatility for progressing riders, having got to see my wife, as I mentioned, who is a beginner, starting to do her first jumps and make a ton of progress on this kite. So there you have it, my best of the year for 2024. Please comment what was your favorite kite of the year, what you think of my lists, where you'd arrange them personally, any changes for any kites and reviews you'd like to see coming up in 2025. And one added note, I'm also planning to do a fair bit of international kite traveling this coming year, and in doing so, creating content, vlogs, and spot guides about the various places I go. So I'm really looking for your suggestions where I should be traveling and what time of year I should be planning to get there. Any comments below on this would be greatly appreciated, and hopefully by the end of the year I'll have a great big air focused travel destination guide. As always, please like and subscribe to my channel and check out my Instagram to see what kites I'm testing or where I'm riding next. Until the next review, I wish you all the best for your sends in 2025. Goodbye.